Hi guys. Tonight we begin in the darkness before dawn, somewhere on the northern frontier of the Roman Empire. The year is around 50 CE. The place has no name that history will remember. It is simply a hillside in the province of Germania, a few miles from a river the locals call the Rhine, and you would not be able to see it even if the sun were up, because the snow has been falling since afternoon and shows no sign of stopping. You are lying on your back inside a leather tent that smells of animal grease and 8 men and 10,000 miles of hard road. Your name, as far as Rome is concerned, is a number on a roster. You are a legionnaire of the Legio 20th Valeria Victrix, the 20th Legion, one of the most decorated fighting units in the history of the ancient world. You have marched through 3 provinces in the last 2 years. You have built more roads, dug more trenches, and carried more weight on your back than any man in any previous century of human history would consider reasonable. And tonight, like every night before it and every night still to come, your job is simply this: sleep. Not because you are comfortable, you are not. Not because you are warm, you are not that either. But because a Roman soldier who does not sleep is a Roman soldier who cannot fight. And a Roman soldier who cannot fight is, to the eyes of Rome, no soldier at all. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And drop your location and local time in the comments. I love knowing where in the world people are listening from tonight. Now, dim the lights, let the world outside go quiet, and follow me into the Roman night. The first thing you notice when you try to sleep in a Roman military camp is the sound. Not silence, never silence. Something else entirely. A low, constant hum that comes from every direction at once. From the leather tents stretching in perfectly straight rows in every direction as far as the firelight reaches. From the thousands of men inside them breathing and turning and occasionally coughing. From the horses shifting in their lines at the camp's edge. From the mules settling into their straw. From the sentries pacing the earthen rampart in their iron-studded sandals, their footsteps slow and deliberate and strangely comforting in the dark. A mainstream historical fact about this sound. Roman military theorists actually considered it beneficial. The writers who documented legion camp procedure noted that the consistent ambient noise of a functioning camp, breathing men, shifting animals, patrolling sentries, created what we would now call a white noise environment. The sound told every sleeping soldier at a level below conscious thought that the camp was functioning normally, that the sentries were at their posts, that nothing had gone wrong, that it was safe to sleep. And in the ancient world, where armies could be destroyed in their sleep by a sufficiently quiet and organized enemy, the sound of a functioning camp was the sound of safety. You lie on your back and listen to it. The tent around you is called a papilio. The word means butterfly in Latin, named for the way the entrance flaps spread open on warm evenings like wings. There is nothing butterfly-like about it right now. It is 8 panels of thick cowhide stitched together with gut and stretched over wooden poles, the whole structure rubbed inside and out with animal fat to make it waterproof. When the weather is dry, the fat smells faintly rancid. When the weather is wet, as it has been for the past 2 weeks, the fat mixes with the damp leather to create a smell that exists nowhere else on earth. Something between a tannery and a very large, very tired dog. You have not noticed this smell for months. It is simply the smell of shelter now, the smell of home. 8 men share this tent, always 8. A mainstream historical fact that Roman military historians find endlessly fascinating. The contubernium, the 8-man tent group, was the fundamental social unit of the entire Roman army. These 8 men ate together, marched together, built together, and slept together. They shared a mule, they shared a cooking pot, They shared rations weighed to the gram by quartermaster officers who trusted no one. After 6 months together, you know the breathing patterns of every man in this tent better than you know your own heartbeat. The man to your left, you.
Think of him as Sextus, though that is not his name, breathes in short, even pairs. Inhale, inhale, long exhale. You learn to find this pattern in the dark, the way a blind man learns to find a wall. It is simply there, a constant you have stopped noticing, unless it stops. The man to your right breathes more slowly. He served 3 campaigns before this one. His body has learned an economy of effort that yours is still practicing. His sleep is deep and quiet, and almost professional. You have never heard him speak in his sleep. You have never heard him toss. He simply closes his eyes and leaves, and returns in the morning as though nothing happened between. The man directly across from you snores, not loudly, just consistently. A low, steady rumble that rises and falls with total indifference to whether anyone else in the tent would prefer silence. In the first weeks, this bothered you. You would lie awake, cataloguing the exact character of each snore, timing the intervals, predicting the peaks. Now it is simply part of the sound of safety. Another instrument in the orchestra that tells you the camp is well and the night is passing and everything is as it should be. You close your eyes. The ground beneath you is frozen. This is not a metaphor. The soil of the Rhine frontier in winter freezes to a depth that iron stakes cannot fully penetrate, which is why the tent pegs are driven at an angle and why the leather floor of the tent develops frost on its underside by midnight, and why the smell of the tent in the mornings carries that particular cold mineral edge that you have come to associate with German winters. Before lying down, you spread your sagum across the ground. The sagum is your cloak. It is also your blanket. It is also, in the loosest possible sense, your mattress. It is a rectangle of extremely dense sheep's wool, approximately 2 meters long and 1 meter wide, woven so tightly that a drop of water placed on its surface rolls off without penetrating, because the natural lanolin in the wool repels moisture the way waxed leather repels rain. A quirky detail that military historians note about the sagum: its cost was deducted directly from a legionnaire's pay, not given, deducted. The Roman army issued it to you and then charged you for the privilege over the course of your service. This created a powerful, practical incentive to care for it with extreme diligence. Men who lost their sagum through carelessness faced 2 simultaneous punishments: the financial one from the quartermaster's ledger and the physical one from the German winter. You have never lost yours. You spread it now across the small patch of ground that is yours, and you lie down on one half, and you pull the other half over yourself, and you are in something that would not be recognized by any modern person as a bed, but which you find, at the end of a day of marching and digging and carrying, genuinely sufficient. The warmth begins to build almost immediately. Not from outside. There is no warmth outside tonight. From the 8 bodies in this small space, exhaling, radiating, working unconsciously against the cold in the way that human bodies have always worked, since long before Rome existed and long before anyone thought to put walls around the process. You breathe in. The air tastes of leather and smoke and the faint sourness of bread that has traveled a long way to reach this frontier. You breathe out. The tent around you settles into its rhythm. The camp hums. The ground is the first enemy, not Germania, not the tribes beyond the Rhine who move through the forests without sound, not the cold, which is considerable. The ground. Specifically the way cold travels upward through frozen soil and through thin wool with a patience and thoroughness that no blanket can entirely defeat. You learned this in your first winter campaign, lying on your back on what you thought was adequately insulated ground, and waking at 2 in the morning with the cold in your bones in a way that no amount of additional covering could correct, because the cold was already inside. The Romans had several solutions to this problem. Each one was simpler than modern ingenuity would expect, and each one worked. The most important was straw. Before making camp, a portion of each contubernium's daily work was the collection of dry plant material from the surrounding landscape. Straw, if farmland was nearby, dried leaves if the camp was in forest, pine needles if it
was in the north, cut grass if the season permitted. This material was spread in a layer across the tent's ground space before the sleeping men lay down. Not deep, a hand's width at most. But a hand's width of dry organic material creates an insulating barrier between frozen earth and sleeping body that modern outdoor equipment specialists will confirm is surprisingly effective. A mainstream historical fact. The Roman military manual, attributed in various forms to the writer Vegetius and to earlier sources he drew from, specifically addresses the preparation of sleeping ground as a matter of troop readiness. A well-rested soldier fights better. A soldier who has not slept on adequately insulated ground is not a well-rested soldier. Therefore, ground preparation is a military matter, not a comfort matter. The Romans would not have recognized the distinction between those two things in this context. Comfort that serves survival is simply good tactics. You collected pine needles this afternoon, before the snow started. The nearest pine grove was perhaps 400 meters from the camp perimeter, and the centurion gave the contubernium 15 minutes to gather what they needed, and you gathered with the efficiency of people who have learned exactly what 15 minutes of pine needles produces in terms of comfort, and what happens to the night when you fall short. They are spread beneath you now. You can feel the faint springiness of them through your sagum. The smell they release when compressed by your weight is something between sharpness and sweetness, the smell of the living tree still faintly present in the dead needles, the smell of the forest outside the camp walls distilled into something small and clean beneath you. Combined with the sagum above and below, combined with the 8 bodies generating heat in the enclosed space, combined with the leather walls of the papilio blocking the wind, it is enough. Not warm exactly, not comfortable in any way that a modern person would use that word freely, but enough. The body has a remarkable capacity to decide that enough is sufficient when the alternative is less than enough. You learned this early. You have refined the lesson over 2 years of winter campaigns. You shift your weight slightly, finding the configuration that puts the most insulation between your spine and the ground. The pine needles compress and resettle with a soft sound, a quirky detail that survives in several Roman sources. Legionnaires developed strong preferences for particular types of ground material. Experienced soldiers would sometimes walk significant distances to collect fern fronds rather than pine needles, or dried rushes rather than grass, based on their assessment of the insulating properties of different plant materials. This knowledge was passed informally within contubernia, from veterans to new recruits, as practically as any knowledge about weapon maintenance or formation tactics. The man who taught you about pine needles was a veteran from Hispania who had served 7 years before you joined the Legion. He showed you how to layer them with the stems pointing down and the soft needle ends up, like a bed of small crossed fingers. He showed you how thick to lay them, and how to replace the outer layer every 3 days before it compacted beyond usefulness. He showed you, in short, how to sleep in Germany. He died in a river crossing 6 months ago. The information survived. You press your back more firmly into the pine needles and feel the faint warmth that they trap against you begin to stabilize and hold. Overhead, through the leather roof, you hear the snow accumulating. Not a sound exactly, but a change in the quality of the silence. A slight additional muffling of the camp's sounds. A faint creak of the tent poles as the weight builds. The snow is insulation too, you know. A veteran told you that in your first winter. 4 inches of snow on a tent is warmer inside than 2 inches. The snow traps air. The air traps heat. The physics of it work the same whether you understand the physics or not. You close your eyes. The ground beneath you is frozen, but you are not on the frozen ground. You are on pine needles. The pine needles are a small architecture of survival, built in 15 minutes before the snow came, serving you now without demanding anything further from you. You breathe in the smell of pine and leather and wool and cold. You breathe out. The ground holds you. The sagum is worth understanding properly, not because it is complex, it is the opposite of complex, but because the simplicity of it and what that simplicity achieved says something important about the relationship between the Roman army and the problem of the winter night. Modern outdoor equipment uses synthetic materials that trap heat through insulation, layers of trapped air woven into fabric that surrounds the sleeping body and prevents heat from escaping into the surrounding environment. The technology is effective. The materials are lightweight. The engineering behind them represents centuries of development. The sagum predates all of that by 2 millennia and achieves something remarkably close to the same result through entirely different means. Sheep's wool contains crimped fibers that naturally create air pockets within the fabric. These air pockets insulate. Additionally, the natural oils in wool, primarily lanolin, coat the fibers in a way that allows moisture to move through the fabric without the fabric itself becoming saturated. A wool cloak in rain gets wet on the outside. The inside remains dry. The insulating air pockets survive. The warmth persists. A mainstream historical fact, this property of wool, its ability to insulate even when wet, was understood and documented by Roman military writers as a specific tactical advantage. The armies of various Germanic tribes, the historical sources note, tended to use animal hides as their primary cold weather protection. Hides are excellent insulators when dry. When wet, they stiffen, crack, and lose most of their thermal properties. Roman wool, by contrast, continued to insulate through rain, through snow, through the wet cold of river crossings and the soggy ground of northern European winters. You have tested this comparison personally, though without knowing the history. You simply know that on the river crossing 6 months ago, when the column waded chest deep through Rhine water so cold it hurt to breathe, and emerged on the other bank, soaking and shaking and desperate for warmth, the men who wrapped their sagums tight around themselves and moved quickly began to warm within minutes. The warmth came from inside the wet wool, generated by the bodies wearing it, trapped by the lanolin-coated fibers that refused to let it escape. The sagum saved your life on that crossing. You don't think of it in those terms. You think of it the way you think of your boots and your gladius and the tent pole you carry, as equipment, as something that exists because the army decided you needed it and deducted the cost from your wages. But tonight, lying in the tent with the wool spread around and above you, you feel what it does without naming it. The warmth that builds slowly inside the cloak's fold is your warmth. It is produced by your body and held there by the wool's architecture, not generated from outside, but preserved from within. 8 bodies in a papilio, each wrapped in a sagum, each holding their own heat inside a dense rectangle of sheep's wool, and all of it occurring inside a small, enclosed space of thick, oiled leather that blocks the wind and slows the cold. The mathematics of it produce something that no single element would produce alone. The tent is warmer than the air outside by a margin that modern researchers studying similar enclosed winter shelters have measured at between 5 and 15 degrees Celsius. Not enough to be comfortable, enough to survive. Enough, combined with the exhaustion of a day that began before dawn and ended after dark, to sleep. A quirky detail from Roman military sources, it was strictly forbidden to wear your armor to sleep. Not a suggestion, forbidden.
Officers were empowered to punish soldiers found sleeping in their lorica, their metal body armor, under the same regulations that governed other breaches of camp discipline. The reason was practical and physiological. Metal conducts heat. A metal breastplate lying against a human body at night does not warm up. It draws heat from the body, conducting it outward through the metal into the surrounding air, which is colder than the body and in which the metal rapidly equilibrates. A soldier sleeping in metal armor in winter temperatures will wake colder than he lay down, possibly hypothermic, and, if the temperature drops sufficiently, certainly not awake at all. The Roman army understood this without the vocabulary of thermal conduction. They understood it through the evidence of soldiers who had made the mistake and the consequences that followed. The regulation emerged from observation. The observation was correct. Your armor is stacked beside you now, neatly, close enough to reach in seconds, arranged in the order in which it must be put on, so that if the alarm sounds in the night, you can begin dressing in darkness with only your hands to guide you and reach the camp wall inside a minute. But it is off your body. It is cold metal in the cold air, drawing nothing from you, costing you nothing. You are warm wool against pine needles. You breathe in and feel the warmth in the air around your face. You breathe out, and the warmth remains. Not everyone in the camp is sleeping. This is part of what makes sleeping in the camp safe enough to be deep rather than shallow, real rather than vigilant. The knowledge carried in the body below conscious thought that others are watching while you rest. The Romans called the night watch the vigilia, a word that gives us the English word vigilant, and also, by a long path, the word vigil. The night was divided into 4 equal watches, each lasting approximately 3 hours, depending on the season and the length of darkness. The first vigilia began at sunset. The 4th ended at dawn. A mainstream historical fact about the mathematics of this system: the timekeeping device used to measure the watches was a clepsydra, a water clock, in which water dripped from one vessel into another at a calculated rate, and the level in the lower vessel indicated the passage of time. The centurion of the guard used the clepsydra to time the watch changes and sounded the change with a trumpet blast, whose note and length told every man in the camp which watch was beginning. This meant that even in your sleep, the sound of the trumpet organized your night. The first call told your sleeping body, still carrying hours of work to do before it was finished with recovery, that darkness had settled and the camp was secured. The second call, at some point in the middle of the night, said half the darkness has passed. The third said the 4th watch is beginning. The 4th, at dawn, said the night is done. You learned to sleep through all of these calls, not the first time. The first winter, every trumpet note snapped you awake, heart going, hand reaching for the gladius that wasn't there because you'd remembered, just in time, that you were in your tent, and the trumpet was schedule and not alarm. The second winter, you learned to let the calls move through you like water, present, registered, incorporated, dismissed. Information without urgency. Confirmation without alarm. The sentries who walk the earthen rampart tonight are your comrades. You know some of them. You know the particular sound of the iron-shod sandals on frozen dirt. You know that they are cold and bored and alert in the way that people are alert when boredom and fear exist in the same body at the same time. You know that they are carrying the night on your behalf. You have done it for them. You will do it for them again. The rotation is fair. The centurions enforce the fairness with an attention to detail that borders on mathematical. No man serves the third watch, the hardest one, the middle of the night, when the cold is deepest and the body most resistant to wakefulness, more often than his fair proportion. The mathematics of fairness in the vigilia were understood as a matter of morale, and therefore a matter of military effectiveness. A quirky detail preserved in Roman military sources: sentries on watch were forbidden to sit, to lean against the wall, or to put down their weapons. They were required to pace, to walk back and forth along their section of the rampart in a continuous, deliberate movement throughout their 3-hour watch. The reason was physiological. A standing body in winter cold loses heat faster than a moving body. A standing body also fights sleep less effectively than a moving one. 3 hours of pacing along an earthen wall in darkness and snow is not comfortable, but it is survivable, and it keeps the sentry awake, which is the point. The penalty for falling asleep on watch was death, not dismissal, not flogging, death, administered by the sentry's own comrades in a ritual called the fustuarium, in which the centurion touched the sleeping man with a staff, and every other soldier in the unit then struck him once with a club or stone. The collective responsibility meant that every man had personal investment in every other man's wakefulness. This system, brutal as it was, worked. The historical record of Roman camps being overrun in night attacks is vanishingly thin compared to the historical record of other ancient armies suffering exactly that fate. Roman legionnaires did not fall asleep on watch. The consequence for doing so was too immediate and too personal. You are not on watch tonight. You served the second Vigilia 2 nights ago, and the rotation will not bring you back for another 4 days. Tonight is yours. All of it. All the darkness. And your body knows this without being told. You hear, very faintly through the leather walls, the sound of the current watch pacing. Steady. Slow. Back and forth. Iron on frozen earth. The sound is one more instrument in the orchestra of safety. Someone is awake. Someone is watching. The camp is secure. You breathe out slowly. Your shoulders release toward the ground. Here is something that people who have not studied the Roman army do not immediately understand. The entire massive construction project that the legion carried out every single evening, the trench, the rampart, the sharpened stakes, the precisely aligned tent rows, the measured buffer zone, the designated cooking areas and latrine trenches, was not primarily for defense. It was primarily for sleep. A mainstream historical fact: Roman military engineers calculated the dimensions of the standard marching camp's defensive perimeter based not only on what would stop an enemy attack, but on what would allow 10,000 men to sleep deeply enough to recover from the previous day's march and be capable of fighting the next morning. The defensive trench, typically a V-shape approximately 1 meter wide and 1 meter deep running around the entire perimeter, served 2 psychological functions simultaneously. The first was physical. Any enemy attempting to cross it in darkness would make enough noise to alert the sentries. The second was what modern psychologists would call threat environment control. The men sleeping inside the perimeter did not need to consciously worry about silent infiltration because silent infiltration was geometrically impossible. The body, accordingly, did not need to maintain the level of vigilance during sleep that it would maintain in an unfortified position. The buffer zone inside the rampart, the empty strip of ground, always exactly 200 feet wide between the defensive wall and the nearest tent, was not wasted space. It was calculated space. Roman military engineers had measured, through the ugly empiricism of previous campaigns, the maximum effective range of a barbarian arrow fired blindly over a defensive wall in darkness. 200 feet was beyond that range. An enemy who managed to reach the wall and fire arrows over it would hit only empty ground. The men in the tents were beyond the reach of blind fire. A quirky detail from Polybius, the Greek historian who embedded with Roman armies in the 2nd century BCE and wrote the most detailed surviving account of Roman military practice. He specifically notes that the regularity and predictability of the camp layout, the fact that every man knew exactly where every structure was in relation to every other structure, meant that in a night alarm, soldiers could move from their tents to their assigned defensive positions in darkness, at speed, without collisions, without confusion, without the terrifying cascade of friendly fire accidents that destroyed other armies in nighttime engagements. They practiced this, regular drills in darkness, running the camp streets by memory. Not because they expected to use the skill, because the certainty that they could use it if needed was itself part of what allowed them to sleep. You know exactly where you are in relation to everything else in this camp. You know it with your body, not just your mind. You know that the Contubernium tent, 3 rows to your right, is the 7th cohort's 3rd century. You know that the Via Principalis, the main road running through the camp's center, is 40 feet behind you. You know that the water point is northeast, that the latrines are southwest, that the cavalry is beyond the 3rd row on the left, and that the centurion's tent is exactly where it always is, close enough to the rampart to hear any change in the sentries. Pacing. You know this because you built this camp. You and the 8,000 other men who marched here dug these trenches and drove these stakes and laid out these streets in the precise formation that the Legion has used in every campaign, in every province, for 200 years. The camp is yours. Its geometry is in your hands. Historians still argue about which element of Roman military discipline was most responsible for the Legion's extraordinary effectiveness. Some emphasize the training, others emphasize the equipment, others emphasize the command structure, but lying in your tent tonight, in a fortress that was non-existent 12 hours ago and will cease to exist by noon tomorrow, you understand something that the historians debate from a comfortable distance. It is the sleep. The Romans slept inside perfection. Every night, every campaign. The perfection cost them enormous labor, an estimated 800 calories per legionnaire per evening just in camp construction. But what it purchased was the deepest, most restorative sleep available to any army in the ancient world. The Germanic tribes sleeping in their forests tonight are cold and anxious, and lying in no particular arrangement with no particular system. Their sleep is shallow and fragmented. Their bodies are spending energy on vigilance that should be spent on recovery. The Roman soldier 10 feet to your left is snoring softly. He marched 20 miles today. He dug a trench. He drove stakes. He ate, and he has slept, deeply and without interruption, inside a fortress built by 10,000 people for the sole purpose of making exactly this sleep possible. You breathe in. The leather walls hold the warmth that 8 bodies have generated. The pine needles hold you off the frozen ground. You breathe out. The camp hums its constant, patient hum. Earlier tonight, before the darkness was complete, the Contubernium built their fire, not inside the tent, never inside the tent. The oiled leather of the papilio and the dry pine needles beneath it would require only one careless moment to become a catastrophe that no army in the field has the resources to survive. The fire was built outside, in the designated cooking area between tent rows, and it was built and managed and extinguished by men who had been doing exactly this for years. The fire's job was not to warm you through the night. Its job was done in the hour before sleep. You ate barley porridge. This is not a romantic meal. You are aware of this. The barley came from supply wagons that followed the column at a distance of 3 days, which means it has been in storage for 3 days before that, and traveled for some weeks before reaching the supply wagons, and spent some further time in the granaries before that. It is dry, dense, slightly musty, cooked in water heated to a grudging boil over wet German firewood that produced more smoke than heat, and flavored with a modest quantity of salt, and very occasionally with dried herbs from whatever foraging was possible in the landscape through which you marched. It was warm, which is all that mattered. A mainstream historical fact, Roman military rations were calculated by nutritional effectiveness with a precision unusual for the ancient world. The primary grain, typically wheat or barley, provided approximately 3,000 calories per day,
when supplemented by the small quantities of salt fish, olive oil, and wine vinegar that constituted the rest of the standard legionnaire's diet. Modern nutritional analysis of these rations suggests they were not merely sufficient, but reasonably well calibrated for the caloric demands of a marching, building, fighting army. The timing of the evening meal was also not accidental. The Legion ate several hours before sleep. The campfires were built and the food cooked during the final hours of daylight and the first hour of darkness. By the time you lay down in the tent, the meal had been digesting for 2 to 3 hours. This interval, which modern nutritional science confirms as optimal for sleep onset and sleep quality, existed not because Roman military planners had studied sleep medicine, but because the schedule of building a marching camp, which occupied the first hours after the column halted, naturally created this gap between arrival and sleep. They built first. They ate during construction and immediately after. They slept last. The sequencing was practical. It produced, as a byproduct, the optimal conditions for restorative sleep. The full stomach had time to do its work. The body, its immediate needs met, could direct its resources toward the recovery that the night required. A quirky detail from Roman supply records: the contubernium's cooking equipment, a bronze mess kit, a small hand mill for grinding grain, a frying pan, and a metal cooking pot, was carried by the shared mule alongside the tent. The mule was, in the Legion's informal accounting, more valuable than most of its human charges. A mule that died on campaign meant its contubernium carried the tent themselves, 20 kilograms of wet cowhide in addition to their personal equipment. The care given to the mules, accordingly, was considerable and genuine. Your mule's name is something between a word and a sound that the men in your contubernium have been calling it for so long that none of them can remember when it started. The mule does not appear to care. It eats what is given to it and carries what it is loaded with, and occasionally brays at 3 a.m. in a voice that could wake a province. It has not done this tonight. You are grateful. The fire was extinguished 2 hours ago. The coals were buried in sand. The cooking area was cleared. In the morning, it will be inspected, as everything in the camp is inspected, as part of the Legion's management of fire risk that extends to the prohibition on fires inside tents and the requirement that all cooking be done in designated areas at specified distances from the tent lines. The warmth the fire left in you is still there, very faintly, a residual heat that lives in the center of your body where the barley porridge settled and the hot water you drank alongside it spread its warmth into the surrounding tissue. It is not much, but it is something. A reminder that the body was recently provided for, that it does not need to spend the night in alert, searching mode, that the needs have been met, the inventory is adequate, and rest is permitted. You breathe in. The smell of the camp's extinguished fires drifts through the tent walls, that particular smell of doused coals, cold ash, and winter air. You breathe out. The warmth in your center holds. The hardest thing about sleeping in a Roman military camp is not the cold. It is not the ground. It is not the smell of the tent, or the snoring of the man across from you, or the 3-hourly sound of the watch change trumpet, or the occasional bray of a mule that you did not name and feel affection for anyway. The hardest thing is turning off the part of your mind that is still a person from a city, from a family, from a life that existed before the Legion and will presumably exist again after it, if after it comes. That part of the mind does not sleep well in German winters. It lies in the dark and conducts its own review of the situation. It notes the distance from home. It calculates how long until the enlistment term ends. It revisits the river crossing 6 months ago when the water was so cold that for approximately 20 seconds you were not certain you were going to reach the other bank. It worries about the supply wagon, which was 3 days behind schedule last week and may have fallen further behind since. Roman military culture develops specific answers to this problem. not psychological counseling in any modern sense, but a set of practices and attitudes that functioned, in aggregate, as a system for managing the mental state of soldiers who needed to sleep well under conditions that provided no obvious reason to feel at ease. The first of these was the contubernum itself. 8 men, years together, bound by more shared difficulty than most families accumulate in a lifetime. When you lie down in this tent, you are surrounded by people who have seen what you have seen. You do not need to explain the river crossing. Everyone in this tent was in the river. The understanding is complete and mutual, and requires no words. A mainstream historical fact. Modern military psychology has identified cohesion within small units, the 8 to 12 person team level, as the primary predictor of resilience under stress. Soldiers in highly cohesive small units sleep better, recover faster, and perform more consistently than soldiers in units with low cohesion, regardless of the objective conditions of the environment. The Roman contubernum system, which bound 8 men into a permanent, stable social unit, duration of their service, created exactly this cohesion through the entirely practical mechanism of shared resource management and shared survival. They were not trying to create psychological support networks. They were trying to organize tent assignment and mule ownership. The psychological support was the byproduct. A quirky detail. Roman legionnaires were specifically prohibited from forming close personal relationships with their commanding officers. The distance between centurion and legionnaire was maintained deliberately. The bond that the legion encouraged was horizontal, between equals, not vertical. The contubernum, not the chain of command, was where emotional life lived in the Roman army. You understand this without having thought about it analytically. You understand it the way you understand the smell of the tent, completely, bodily, without needing to articulate it. The man breathing in pairs to your left, the professional sleeper to your right, the veteran snorer across from you. These are not friends in the way the word is used in peacetime. The category is different, closer in some ways. The things you have not said to each other because there was no need to say them, because everything was already known. Those things constitute a kind of intimacy that civilian life produces rarely. Historians still argue about whether Roman legionnaires experienced what modern researchers call post-traumatic stress in the contemporary sense. The debate turns partly on whether the social structures around them, the contubernum, the legion's deep rhythmic certainty, provided enough psychological buffering to prevent the kind of isolated, unprocessed experience that modern trauma research identifies as the primary driver of long-term psychological damage. Lying in this tent, you are not isolated. You are surrounded. The suffering, whatever it consists of, and you do not examine it closely, because examining it closely is not something that Roman military culture encourages, and you have absorbed that culture completely. The suffering is shared. Distributed across 8 bodies in a leather tent, each carrying their portion, none of them carrying it alone. The worrying mind, the one from the city and the family and the life before, begins to quiet. Not because the worries are resolved, they are not. The supply wagon may still be 3 days behind. The Rhine will need to be crossed again in spring. The enlistment ends when it ends, and not before. But the body is warm enough. The ground is insulated. The sentries are pacing. The trumpet will not call alarm tonight. Its voice is familiar enough now that you would know the difference before you are fully awake. The man to your left breathes in pairs. The man to your right breathes like sleep is a skill he mastered years ago. You breathe in. The tent holds the warmth. You breathe out. The mind releases. This is how 10,000 Roman soldiers sleep. Not in luxury, never in luxury. In a fortress made of frozen earth and sharpened wood, and mathematics so precise it took 2 centuries of bloody failure to develop. Built every night and abandoned every morning, and rebuilt again the following evening
in a different field, in a different province, while remaining, essentially, identical. Inside that fortress, in tents that smell of animal grease and human effort, on pine needles laid over frozen ground, wrapped in wool that holds their heat and keeps the cold at distance by the smallest of margins. Inside all of this, the finest army in the ancient world sleeps. Not as a concession to weakness, not as a luxury to be minimized, as a military strategy, as the foundational investment in tomorrow's capability that no amount of training or equipment or tactical genius can compensate for if it is missing. The army that sleeps well wins in the morning. This is not a philosophical claim. It is the conclusion of 200 years of Roman military experience, written in the records of campaigns that succeeded and campaigns that failed, distilled into the regulations that govern every detail of the marching camp, from the depth of the defensive trench to the prohibition on sleeping in metal armor. They built the fortress for the sleep. The sleep built the empire. The snow is still falling outside your tent. The camp hums with the sound of thousands of men breathing in the same rhythm, watched over by sentries who pace with iron on frozen earth, timed by water dripping in a bronze vessel in the centurion's tent, organized by a geometry that makes the darkness safe. The man to your left breathes in pairs. The man to your right breathes like a professional. The man across from you snores with magnificent consistency. Your pine needles hold you off the cold ground. Your sagum holds your warmth inside its wool. The leather walls hold the dark outside. You breathe in. You are very tired. In the way that a body becomes tired when it has done what bodies were designed to do, moved and built and carried and worked under an open sky in cold air from before dawn to after dark. This is not the tired of anxiety or insomnia or the particular exhaustion of lying awake. This is the tired of completion, the tired of a day fully used. The watch continues outside. The trumpet is quiet. The camp hums. You breathe out. The cold is there, but it cannot reach you through the wool and the needles and the 8 bodies sharing this small, warm space. It waits outside the leather walls like any patient thing. It will be there in the morning. You will meet it in the morning. Tonight is not for the cold. Tonight is not for the river crossing or the supply wagons or the distance from home. Tonight is for this. The pine needles beneath you, the sagum above you, the sound of your comrades breathing in the dark, the distant, steady pace of men who are watching so that you do not have to. The fortress built every night so that the army inside it can simply rest. You are inside the fortress now. Let the walls hold. Let the sentries pace. Let the warmth build in the wool and stay. Let the breath slow. Let the mind release the day. The morning will be cold. The morning is not yet. Sleep.